Forbidden Forest. I doubt our elderly friend is simply experiencing nostalgic feelings when he occasionally reminisces about his childhood. It's not an exaggeration to think that he possesses a flexible mindset, always able to connect even the simplest looking memory to a current issue. He did the same that day.
A memory from my childhood came to mind. I had listened to a children's radio play and was so captivated by it that I burst into laughter. It was so impactful that even after more than half a century, I still remember it today. A group of children took turns speaking, picking up where the previous one left off, and completely diverting the story to irrelevant points. It was utter nonsense. It was a successful application of jumping from topic to topic. Thinking about it today, it's become quite a meaningful metaphor. Everyone talks, and at gatherings of friends, everyone focuses not on what the other person is saying, but on their own story. The absurd chain of stories that brought laughter in childhood actually transforms into a kind of tragicomic reality in adulthood. It's both entertaining with its variety and surprises, and sad because of the inability to establish a shared meaning. That chain of nonsense, pure fun in childhood, becomes a kind of tragedy in adulthood. Because that disconnect is no longer just a game, but a loneliness that has permeated the very essence of communication. This absurd freedom, the children's flight from branch to branch, the torrent of laughter, the adults' similar flight, but no longer laughter, but monologues where no one listens to each other, everyone closed off to their own story, and ultimately, no shared meaning can be established.
He paused briefly. Then, he got to what he really wanted to say and dropped the bombshell.
Now, why did I mention this? One day, while reviewing my relationships with my close circle of friends, I realized that what we were experiencing was exactly like what I've just described. And then, I kicked them all out.
Frankly, at that moment, I think everyone present felt like they'd been slapped in the face. At the very least, it was practically a watch your step message. He wasn't mincing words. However, I can say that, inexplicably, he acted in a manner perfectly suited to the story he was telling. He considered his own flapping wings as freedom, while others were merely being tossed about. This gardener, wandering in his own forbidden forest, resented others getting lost among the branches, and saw the clowning he unforgiven in others as mere being tossed about. Then, without any introduction, he jumped straight to the point.
You will all recognize the person I'm about to talk about. As a general surgeon, he worked in various hospitals across the country. His political career began with the founding of the ruling party. He entered Parliament as a member of Parliament. During that period, he held a position very close to the top, serving as both the Prime Minister's private secretary and physician. However, during his time as a member of Parliament, he became known for his harsh criticisms of internal party politics and some government practices. His outspokenness, particularly on agricultural policies, allegations of corruption and privatizations, characterized by his uncompromising stance on ethical principles, led to his expulsion from the party a few years later. Shortly after his expulsion, while he was abroad for language training, an arrest warrant was issued against him in connection with a major case. During this time, he was unable to return to the country and lived in exile abroad for approximately 12 years.
After the intense warning session we just had, I think everyone in the group solved the riddle immediately. The person our elderly friend was talking about had a determined personality with a fighting spirit, and had passed all the exams to get his medical degree accepted by the system in a foreign country. There, he worked as a surgeon at a major university hospital and established a private health center. After a short pause, our professor continued.
Due to his successful work, he received an award from the Senate and was selected as one of the 40 most successful foreigners. After being acquitted in the case against him, he returned to the country. After a while, he joined one of the opposition parties. He was re-elected as a member of parliament in the general elections. He was given important positions within the party and re-entered active politics. In general, he was seen as a figure with strong oratorical skills, who particularly liked to speak with evidence on issues such as health and corruption, and who also attracted attention with his insider observations on the history of the ruling party.
Our elderly friend eventually brought up one of the files of this active member of parliament. This file, highly susceptible to conspiracy theories, contained a multi-layered and unethical chain of events, the consequences of which we are still experiencing, involving a cataclysm surrounding a deceased person. The international dimension of a crime against humanity uncovered on the other side of the world involved many countries. Our country was among them, and the member of parliament was demanding an investigation into this connection. The international dimension of this case essentially required that the court handling it also be international, and the world had not yet fully reached such a point requiring cooperation. However, as usual, our elderly friend first went into the history of the matter.
In ancient times, the laws of war were based more on religious beliefs, chivalric honor, and traditions than on written texts. The Code of Hammurabi and Hittite texts contain references to not harming civilians and cultivated lands. The famous orders given by Abu Bakr to his army include principles that can be considered precursors to modern laws of war, such as not cutting down trees and not harming women, children, and religious figures. In medieval Europe, the concept of just war began to be debated, and violence against the unarmed was considered dishonorable. The use of poison gas was prohibited, the killing of surrendered soldiers was prevented, and the administration of occupied territories was regulated. Even without written rules, it was declared that civilians and combatants were under the protection of, quote, principles of humanity and public conscience. However, the prevailing understanding until World War II was that a nation, with all its resources, its factories, workers, cities, was part of the war. But the great destruction and tragedies of World War II, such as the Holocaust, showed that the existing rules were insufficient. The events in Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki are the most tragic evidence of why the laws of war had to undergo a radical transformation. And the steps taken between 1948 and 1949 were an attempt to close the legal vacuum born from the ashes of these catastrophes, and were a form of self-criticism.
To help us fully grasp the seriousness of the situation, our elderly friend began to depict these tragedies in dark colors, like a nightmare.
The attack on the historic city of Dresden lasted for 4 nights straight in February 1945. When the attack ended, Dresden was not completely destroyed. However, among the bombs used by the Allies were phosphorus bombs. Countless bombers targeted railway stations in the city center, dropping over a ton of phosphorus bombs, also known as incendiary bombs, and nearly 1.5 tons of other high-explosive bombs. As a result, Dresden burned and was destroyed for days after the bombing ended. Approximately 25,000 of the nearly 30,000 buildings were destroyed. Most of those who died did not die from burns, but from suffocation due to the sudden heat that consumed the oxygen in the area. 60% of the city's area was severely affected, with 15 square kilometers of the city center completely destroyed. The Allies described the operation as a legitimate bombing of a military and industrial target. However, the majority of those killed were women and children. After 5 years of research, the Dresden Historians Commission concluded in an official report published in 2010, 65 years later, that the number of casualties was between 22,500 and 25,000. Even today, anniversaries of the Dresden bombing are commemorated with peace demonstrations, marches, and religious ceremonies in memory of the victims. 6 months after the bombing of Dresden on February 13, 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, located 10,000 kilometers away, would suffer an even more brutal fate: the massacre of civilians.
Our retired professor, with his engaging style, chose to narrate the events from the perspectives of both the perpetrators and the victims.
Immediately after dropping the bomb, the aircraft made a sharp turn and flew away. However, the gust of wind from the explosion violently shook the Enola Gay. Colonel P.T. mistook this shaking for Japanese anti-aircraft fire and shouted, "Anti-aircraft!" At 2:58 p.m., the Enola Gay returned to the northern airfield of Tinian Island. The Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Air Forces, Acting General C.S., awarded P.T. the Airman's Medal of Honor and the others the Air Medal. The name Enola Gay, given to the aircraft, intertwines the purest symbol of a mother's life-giving presence and compassion with one of history's greatest destructions. P.T. carried this heavy irony not with his conscience, but with his military loyalty until his last breath. The bomb, dropped when the plane was at an altitude of 9,632 meters, continued to fall for 43 seconds and exploded at 8:16, at approximately 600 meters above the ground, as calculated to be effective. The tranquility of the morning and the clear sky were suddenly shattered by a blinding flash. A second, and then a hellish explosion. A scorching wave of fire swept through the streets. Buildings, people, and shadows vanished in an instant. A shockwave, like a gust of wind, tore the city apart. As a giant mushroom cloud rose in the sky, the heart of the city fell silent. In a matter of seconds, tens of thousands of lives were extinguished, and the city was reduced to the ashes of a silent catastrophe. It has been confirmed that Yamaguchi was 3 kilometers from the epicenter of the Hiroshima explosion during a business trip. That morning, before leaving the city to go to the shipyard where he worked, he looked up at the clear blue sky and saw something attached to a parachute and an American bomber. Soon after, a blinding flash resembling a giant lightning bolt appeared in the sky. Yamaguchi immediately hid in a ditch that caught his eye. Then a very violent explosion was heard. The shockwave caused by the bomb was so powerful that it lifted Yamaguchi from the ditch where he was hiding and sent him flying into a potato field. When I opened my eyes, it was dark everywhere and I couldn't see very well. It was like the silent flashing blank frames before the first scene in a movie. Ashes raining down from the sky covered Yamaguchi completely, and when he looked up, all he could see was a giant mushroom-like cloud that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Both his eardrums had burst, and he had severe burns on his face and arms. After recovering somewhat, Yamaguchi made his way to the wreckage of the shipyard where he worked. There, he found two colleagues who, like himself, had survived the explosion. The trio spent that night in a shelter, and upon learning that the train station was operational, they set off the next morning. The effects of the atomic bomb were beginning to become apparent in the daylight. In a radio broadcast, Truman declared, "This is the use of the fundamental power of the universe," adding, "The force from which the sun derives its power has been unleashed upon those who brought war to the Far East." Truman warned that if Japan did not surrender, it should expect an unprecedented rain of destruction from the sky. Hiroshima was filled with ruined buildings and melted corpses. They had to cross the river to get to the train station, but the bridge was unusable. Yamaguchi and his colleagues had to swim across the river, which was full of bodies. When he finally reached the train station, he boarded a train with the terrified and injured to his hometown of Nagasaki. Arriving in Nagasaki on the morning of August 8th, Yamaguchi immediately went to the hospital and had his wounds treated. The doctor who treated him was a school friend. However, because of the dark marks on Yamaguchi's face, he couldn't recognize him. Not only the doctor, his school friend, but even his family couldn't recognize Yamaguchi. Despite being on the verge of both physical and mental collapse, Yamaguchi got out of bed and went to the office of the company where he worked. Around 11 o'clock, he was in a meeting with the company owner, who wanted information about what had happened in Hiroshima. Yamaguchi recounted his experience, but his bosses couldn't believe that a single bomb could be so powerful and thought he was crazy. Just then, there was a very intense flash and explosion. Knowing the shockwave was coming, Yamaguchi hid under the table a few seconds before the windows shattered. At that moment, I thought the mushroom cloud had been following me since Hiroshima. He had been exposed to very severe radiation in the second explosion. Yamaguchi, a Japanese engineer, translator, and educator, dedicated his survival to the nuclear disarmament movement. Until the end of his life, he gave speeches at international platforms to explain the devastating effects of nuclear wars. When he passed away in 2010, he was still remembered worldwide as an exemplary symbol of resistance.
At this point, where we were left breathless, our elderly friend took the matter to the next level.
The Nuremberg trials are considered the, quote, certificate of modern international law and universal jurisdiction. Prior to these trials, it was considered almost impossible for one power to prosecute another state for actions taken against its own citizens or in occupied territories, due to the principle of national sovereignty. The defendant's main defense at the trials was the argument, "I was only following orders from my superiors." The court rejected this. If an individual has a moral choice to disobey an order, carrying out an unlawful order does not absolve them of guilt. While Nuremberg was a crucial turning point, it also sparked a debate among legal scholars, the justice of the victors. Critics argued that some actions deemed criminal were not defined by written international law at the time they were committed. While the Axis powers were put on trial, similar actions by Allied powers that resulted in civilian casualties were not brought to justice. Although Nuremberg was not a perfect mechanism of justice, it was the first major stage to prove to the world that state leaders and military commanders could not hide behind the shield of sovereignty. Approximately 9 months after the atomic bomb disaster, Indian lawyer R.P. served as India's representative at the Far East International Military Tribunal, established after World War II. Of the tribunal's 11 judges, he was the only one who advocated for the acquittal of all defendants. His reasoning was as follows: the tribunal was applying retroactive law, defining crimes that did not exist before the war. The trial was not impartial. It was not justice, but revenge on the part of the victorious powers. He viewed Japan's actions within the context of imperialism as a reflection of Western colonialism. He emphasized that the U.S. use of the atomic bomb should be judged by the same criteria. The use of atomic bombs against civilians was not brought up in the courts. Decisions were generally unanimous. The historic 1,235-page dissenting opinion of Indian Judge Radhabinod Pal, criticizing justice of the victors, left its mark on these decisions. The U.S. chose to preserve the emperor as a political symbol to maintain control over post-war Japan and break popular resistance. This went down in history as an example of a political bargain that contradicted the principle of "no leader is untouchable," established at Nuremberg.
From this point on, our elderly friend continued to discuss the psychology of people who had experienced disasters. The impact of defeat in war on national character varied considerably.
World War II had different repercussions on German and Japanese societies. Despite their rich culture, the Germans accepted responsibility for having suffered such a catastrophe. In Germany, literature and philosophy became the voice of a society questioning its own fate through a sense of collective guilt. The words attributed to the first chancellor made this reckoning a guiding principle. I hope that even if Jesus came, we would not be so foolish as to give all authority to one person. Furthermore, Germany redefined itself within the European Union by placing confronting the past at the center of its identity. The enemy paved the way for democracy, peaceful development, and modernization in this island nation as well. However, the trauma of the catastrophe ingrained feelings of shame and fragility into its identity. In Japan, literature reflected the memory of a society silently carrying an externally imposed fate through the themes of victimhood and identity crisis. Despite the trauma of the atomic bombs, Japan developed an identity of peaceful development through pragmatic cooperation with the United States. Germany's commitment to the EU and Japan's relationship with the US have been not only strategic, but also identity-based compensation mechanisms. Although the two societies followed different paths, they had in common to overcome their identity crises in a way that was consistent with their cultural codes.
It seems that the role and necessity of international courts, despite their initial flaws, are quite obvious. Okay, our esteemed professor's analysis of the personality transformations of these societies, living thousands of kilometers apart and belonging to completely different cultures, was striking and impressive. However, he connected that statement, with a freedom reminiscent of a bird flitting from branch to branch, to the complex personality of the hero he mentioned at one point, drawing a parallel between the archetypal personality structures of the two nations.
Whether our esteemed doctor's personality played a role in his choice of profession, or whether his profession shaped his personality, I cannot say for sure, but I can say that he tended to maintain a resolute attitude, even in uncertain situations, thanks to his high self-confidence. During his professional years, he knew death very well, but he considered getting used to it a personal failure. From the outside, he appeared to have accepted everything with a cool and professional mask. Yet, storms raged within him. His ability to restrain his emotional reactions in moments of sudden stress proved that he possessed unwavering inner discipline. But this silence actually concealed the grief of a defeated warrior. Driven by his passion for perfection, he viewed every loss as a matter of competence, always blaming himself rather than fate. With his assertive, interventionist attitude, declaring, "I draw the line," he never hesitated to tackle any problem, even knowing it would cause him trouble. His impatience was his sharpest trait. He had no tolerance for vague answers, or the complacency of a wait-and-see approach. For him, life was a duel to be won anew at every moment, fueled by the relentless resistance in his mind. His humor was often dark and dry. He used it not as a defense mechanism, but because that's how he truly saw the world. As you know, the profession demands precision, clarity, and control. Politics, on the other hand, demands ambiguity, compromise, and patience. What do these two worlds create in the same body? In which is he more himself? This tension between two identities heightened his awareness of the situations where democracy was helpless. His parliamentary question targeting the Minister of Family Affairs responsible for children would, like others, remain unanswered. After his speech in Parliament, he thought to himself, "I no longer save people, I only describe them. We no longer say we've lost a patient, all we do is hand them over to statistics." In a press statement, while ironically criticizing the government, he says, "Everything in this crisis is technical and controlled. Don't worry, the system is working. It's just that people can't cope." He adds, "The death rate is high in this neighborhood." And then, referring to the perceived devaluation of human life in the country, he makes these politically sharp but also morally disturbing remarks. But don't worry, there are still enough voters. His professional principle of, first, do no harm, has transformed in politics into, sometimes harm is unavoidable. He used to save lives. Now he speaks in numbers. The doctor knows what he's doing, but he's also aware that he can't change it. On the other hand, the JE case, for which the doctor proposed an investigation, is particularly linked to power, wealth, and privilege. JE's ability to evade punishment and his predominantly elite connections were undermining public trust in the justice system, both globally and in our country. This case raised the following questions. How do powerful and wealthy individuals protect themselves from the system? When dealing with a complex and shadowy figure like JE, this instrument and victim paradox actually points to a very cold truth about how the system works. JE is an active operator here. Rather than being a power center in its own right, it's a mechanism that facilitates the work of larger powers. It's a bridge that ensnares powerful figures, politicians, businessmen, royalty, through their weaknesses, making them vulnerable to blackmail. It's an intermediary providing the isolated space and resources necessary for dirty work to be done, such as islands, private jets, and mansions. For intelligence networks or global elites, it's a key that allows them to reach the people they need to control. The term victim here doesn't describe tragic innocence, but rather systematic expendability. When a tool ceases to function, or its existence begins to threaten the main system, it becomes a victim. J.E. had become a pawn sacrificed or silenced for the survival of that vast network. He was a lightning rod, absorbing all the system's filth while ensuring the main actors remained clean. The fact that this is a key layer of the case shows that the responsibility doesn't lie with a single person. If J.E. were merely a criminal, the incident would be the story of a pervert. However, being both an instrument and a victim elevates the case to the level of a, quote, and global criminal organization. The key layer of the case demonstrated how one can be both an instrument and a victim within international networks.
Our old friend, speaking as if to himself, said the following.
This figure, instrumentalized by systemic lack of oversight, is not merely a criminal, but concrete evidence of how exploitable the geographical and legal boundaries of justice can be. J.E.'s role as both instrument and victim demonstrates the inadequacy of national jurisdictions in the face of global networks. The continuity between the justice of the victors and the law of the superior is the very backbone extending from Nuremberg to J.E. If there had been an international transnational oversight mechanism, that instrument could not have been used so effectively. And when he was victimized, a smokescreen would not have been created behind which the real criminals could hide. International justice organizations are necessary to transform the doctor's individual and painful resistance into an institutional reflex. The only way to illuminate the dark corridors where figures like J.E. are both tools and victims is to transform the doctor's personal sense of defeat into a global responsibility for justice.
However, our elderly friend's suggestion immediately met with criticism. One voice objected, pointing out shortcomings.
Do international organizations carry on the legacy of Nuremberg, or have they become instruments of other interests? While indispensable for the global order, they face problems of neutrality, effectiveness, and legitimacy.
Our elderly friend, however, responded as if the topic had shifted.
I'm trying to understand the problem the doctor politician faces. Someone who, as a surgeon, fixes tangible things with his hands, eventually confronts how slow and uncertain it is to fix the system itself. I think the incongruity between the certainty of individual intervention in his profession and the ambiguity of institutional change in politics will be the source of his indescribable tension.